rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield as Laura squinted through the downpour, struggling to keep her old car on the winding road. The highway was empty, a desolate stretch of asphalt cutting through miles of dense, dark forest. Her wipers swished furiously, but the storm was unrelenting, turning the road ahead into a blur of shadows and slick pavement. Laura had been driving for hours, her destination still miles away. Fatigue tugged at her, and the isolation of the road was beginning to gnaw at her nerves. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a figure on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by the car's headlights. A man stood there, drenched to the bone, his thumb out in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Instinctively, Laura's foot eased off the gas. She hesitated, a voice in her head warning her to keep driving, to not let a stranger into her car, especially on a night like this. But another part of her, the part that couldn't ignore the image of him shivering in the cold rain, urged her to stop. After all, she reasoned, she'd want someone to help if she were in his position. The car slowed to a stop, and Laura rolled down her window just enough to speak. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. The man leaned in, water dripping from the brim of his worn hat. His face was gaunt, hollowed by fatigue or something more sinister, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, like he hadn't slept in days. "Anywhere down the road," he replied in a raspy voice. Something about his voice sent a shiver down Laura's spine, but she pushed the feeling aside. She unlocked the passenger door, and the man slid in silently, bringing with him a wave of cold air and the smell of damp earth. They drove in silence for a while. The only sounds were the rhythm of the rain and the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. Laura glanced at the man out of the corner of her eye. His clothes were threadbare, and his hands rested in his lap, long fingers twitching slightly. He hadn't said a word since getting in, and the tension in the car was thick enough to cut with a knife. "So, where are you from?" Laura asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Nowhere," he replied flatly. "Just passing through." The answer did little to ease Laura's growing unease. She tried to focus on the road, but the man's presence was like a dark cloud looming over her. Something about him wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, static filling the small space. Laura jumped slightly, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. The static cleared, and a distorted voice came through, barely intelligible. "Authorities are searching for a man. Hitchhiker. Several disappearances." The voice cut out, leaving only static once more. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at the man beside her, who hadn't moved an inch. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, expression unreadable. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice trembling slightly. The hitchhiker finally turned to her, a slow, eerie smile creeping across his face. "You should have kept driving," he said in that same raspy tone. Fear gripped Laura, her mind racing. Who was this man? The radio had mentioned disappearances, hitchhikers. She tried to stay calm, but every instinct screamed at her to get away from him. Without warning, the car's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. Laura's stomach dropped as the car coasted to a stop, the headlights dimming until they were swallowed by the darkness. They were now stranded in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, with a stranger who had just hinted at something far worse than bad luck. "Engine trouble?" the hitchhiker asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Laura didn't answer. Her hands were shaking as she tried to restart the car, but the engine only whined in protest. Panic began to set in as she fumbled with her phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. "Looks like we're stuck," the hitchhiker said, his smile widening. "Guess it's just you and me." Laura's breath quickened, her mind scrambling for a plan. I need to check under the hood," she stammered, desperate to get out of the car. As she reached for the door handle, the hitchhiker's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he whispered, leaning in closer. His breath was cold against her skin, and his eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were too dark, like staring into a void. Laura yanked her hand away, heart racing. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The hitchhiker's smile vanished, replaced by a chilling, dead expression. "It's not about what I want," he said quietly. "It's about what you took when you stopped." "I don't understand," Laura began, but he cut her off. "You took me in, and now you're part of it," he said, his voice almost pitying. "The road doesn't like to let go once it has you." Laura's blood ran cold. She could feel it now, the oppressive weight of something unseen, something ancient and malevolent. The air inside the car felt thicker, harder to breathe. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, as if the night itself was closing in on them. "Please, I just want to go home," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. The hitchhiker looked at her with something like sadness. "You're already there," he said softly. Before Laura could react, the car filled with a blinding light, a searing, unnatural brightness that burned through her closed eyelids. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the light, by the darkness that followed. And then there was nothing. When the storm finally passed, the road was empty once more, except for Laura's car, now abandoned on the side of the highway. The driver's seat was empty, the door slightly ajar, but there was no sign of Laura or the hitchhiker, only the faint echo of a voice on the wind, whispering of those who had gone before. And somewhere down that lonely road, a figure stood, thumb out, waiting for the next car to stop. The curse continues. Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, and we'll notify you when the next story comes out.